The city does not scream when it is afraid. It becomes quiet. Shadow Knight learned that on a cold night in the forgotten district called Grim Hollow, the streets were empty. Old buildings leaned over narrow alleys like tired giants. Every window was dark, yet he could feel eyes watching from behind the curtains. The signal came from a broken laundromat at the corner of Ash Street. Inside, the air smelled of rust and soap that had long dried into dust. Machines sat in silence like metal skeletons. One washer near the back was still plugged into the wall. Its door was closed. That was the first thing that felt wrong. Shadow Knight stepped closer, his cape brushing the cracked tiles. Slowly he opened the door. Inside was what remained of a woman. Not stabbed, not shot. Erased. For a moment even Shadow Knight did not move. Whoever had done this had not simply killed her. They had tried to make sure nothing of her was left. Footsteps echoed softly outside as police sirens approached in the distance. He activated his communicator. "Commissioner Hale," he said quietly. "You need to see this." As he waited, Shadow Knight looked around the laundromat again. The machines were dead. The lights flickered. But outside the dusty windows, every apartment across the street had its lights on. People were watching. And none of them were calling for help. The body was taken to the city morgue before sunrise. Shadow Knight stood beside the steel table, while Dr. Marlowe adjusted the overhead light. What remained of the woman was barely recognizable, but the doctor worked with calm precision. "This was chemical damage," Dr. Marlowe said quietly. "Strong acid." Shadow Knight folded his arms. "Time of death." "Hard to tell," the doctor replied. "Acid destroys more than flesh. It erases evidence." Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. Shadow Knight looked closer at the bones of the arms. They were raised slightly bent inward. A defensive posture. "She knew," he said. Dr. Marlowe nodded slowly. "Yes. She fought." Hours later, Shadow Knight sat inside the cave beneath his tower, while Orion, his loyal assistant, projected old city records across the screens. The district of Grim Hollow appeared again and again. Crime reports. Missing persons. Old gang investigations. And one name kept returning. The Crimson Mask. A violent gang that once ruled Grim Hollow decades ago. Extortion. Murders. Disappearances. Then suddenly, nothing. The gang vanished. "People stopped talking about them," Orion said. Shadow Knight studied the glowing map of the district. "That kind of fear doesn't disappear," he said quietly. Outside the screens, photos of the laundromat appeared again. And suddenly the silence of Grim Hollow made sense. The district wasn't empty. It was protecting something. The next night, Shadow Knight returned to Grim Hollow. Rain covered the streets in a thin silver layer. Neon lights from distant bars reflected on the wet pavement, but the deeper parts of the district remained dark. Too quiet. Shadow Knight moved across the rooftops, watching the alleys below. That was when he saw it. A man in a rough animal mask was following a woman down an empty street. His steps were slow, careful, like a predator enjoying the hunt. Shadow Knight dropped from the rooftop before the man even noticed. The impact shook the pavement. Before the masked man could run, Shadow Knight grabbed him and pulled him into the air with a grappling line. Seconds later, they were hanging over the edge of a 6-story building. The wind howled around them. The man screamed. Shadow Knight held him by the collar. "Talk," he said calmly. "I didn't do anything." Shadow Knight tightened his grip. The Crimson Mask. The reaction was instant. The man froze. Fear filled his eyes. "I swear I'm not one of them," he shouted. "Nobody is, they're gone." Shadow Knight leaned closer. "Then why are people still whispering their name?" The man shook his head wildly. "You don't understand," he said. "People here remember. And when people remember, they stay quiet." Shadow Knight studied his face for a moment, then pulled him back onto the roof. One thing was now clear. The legend of the Crimson Mask was not dead, and somewhere inside Grim Hollow someone was making sure it stayed alive. For the next 3 nights, Shadow Knight turned Grim Hollow inside out. He moved through alleys, rooftops, basements, and abandoned stores. Every corner of the district had shadows deep enough to hide a secret. And every night the same pattern repeated. People watched. From behind cracked windows. From dark stairwells. From doorways that never opened. They saw everything. And they said nothing. Shadow Knight stopped a robbery in a liquor store. The owner thanked him with silence. A woman witnessed a break-in across the street. She closed her curtains the moment he looked up. Even the criminals refused to talk. One night he dragged 2 gang members onto a rooftop after catching them breaking into a pharmacy. "The Crimson Mask," he demanded. The men shook their heads. "We don't know anything," one of them said quickly. "Wrong answer." Shadow Knight stepped closer. The second man swallowed hard. "Listen. Nobody here talks about that name. Not anymore." "Why?" The man hesitated. Then he whispered, "Because the last people who did, disappeared." That night, Shadow Knight returned to the abandoned laundromat. The rusted machines still sat in the darkness like silent witnesses. He knelt beside the washer where the body had been found. There were ashes scattered across the floor. Not from fire. Something else. Shadow Knight stood slowly and looked out the dusty window. Across the street, every apartment light was on again. Dozens of silhouettes stood behind the glass, watching him, waiting. That was when the truth finally became clear. This was never just a murder. The entire district of Grim Hollow was protecting a secret together. Late that night, Shadow Knight returned to the abandoned laundromat. The streets of Grim Hollow felt different now. The air was heavy, like the district was holding its breath. Somewhere nearby, faint laughter echoed through an alley. When Shadow Knight stepped outside, he noticed them. 3 teenagers standing near the corner. They were watching him. The moment he looked at them, they ran. Shadow Knight moved instantly, launching his grappling line and swinging over a fence. He followed them through narrow alleys, across broken stairways, past old brick walls covered in fading graffiti. The chase ended at the edge of an empty construction lot. The teenagers were gone. In the center of the dirt stood something new. A mound of freshly turned soil. Shadow Knight approached slowly. The wind pushed dust across the ground as he knelt beside it. The shape of the hole was long and narrow. A grave. Someone had dug it recently. He brushed the dirt away and uncovered a wooden box beneath the soil. The size was exact, almost like someone had prepared it for a body. For his body. Shadow Knight opened the lid. Empty. For half a second, confusion crossed his mind. Then the shot came. The bullet tore into his back with brutal force. The impact threw him forward into the dirt. Pain exploded through his chest, as the sound of the rifle echoed across Grim Hollow. Shadow Knight dragged himself behind a broken concrete slab, breathing hard. Above him, on the roof of a nearby building, a faint silhouette moved in the darkness. A sniper. Shadow Knight clenched his teeth. Sloppy, he muttered through the pain. You should have aimed for the head. Blood soaked through Shadow Knight's armor as he forced himself to stand. The sniper's bullet had torn deep into his back. Every breath burned. The world tilted slightly, but he refused to fall. Not yet. Across the construction lot, the old apartment building stood like a dark tower. That was where the shot had come from. Shadow Knight fired his grappling line. The cable shot upward and locked onto the roof. He pulled himself forward, climbing with slow, painful movements. Each step left a small trail of blood on the concrete stairs. By the time he reached the top floor, the hallway lights were flickering. He kicked the final door open. Should have run, he said, through clenched teeth. But the room was not what he expected. There was no young assassin, no gang of killers. Only an old man sitting in a wheelchair near the window. A long sniper rifle rested beside him. The old man looked calm. Almost tired. You finally made it, he said quietly. Shadow Knight stepped forward, unsteady. You shot me. Yes. The old man did not look afraid. I told them you would keep digging, he continued. Heroes like you never know when to stop. Shadow Knight stared at him, trying to understand. You killed that woman. The old man's face twisted with something between anger and sadness. She was mine once, he said slowly. Shadow Knight felt his strength fading. The room spun as his knees finally hit the floor. Outside, the lights of Grim Hollow still burned. Watching. Waiting. And for the first time that night, Shadow Knight realized something terrible. This fight might already be over. The old man rolled his wheelchair a little closer. Moonlight from the broken window revealed his face. Deep wrinkles. Thin gray hair. Eyes that carried decades of bitterness. You want to know why all of this happened, he asked quietly. Shadow Knight tried to stay upright, but the blood loss was getting worse. His vision blurred at the edges. Talk, he managed. The old man gave a dry laugh. People used to respect this place, he said. Back when the Crimson Mask ruled Grim Hollow. Shadow Knight understood immediately. You were one of them. One of the first, the man replied. He gestured toward the dark streets outside. Back then, nobody dared steal here. Nobody dared hurt the people who lived in these blocks. Fear kept everything in order. His voice grew harder. Then the gang fell apart. The city forgot us. And this district turned into garbage. Shadow Knight looked up slowly. And the woman. For the first time, the old man's expression cracked. She was my sweetheart, he said. Years ago. His hands trembled slightly. But she started seeing a police officer. Everyone in the neighborhood knew. The room fell silent. I killed her, the old man said flatly. Buried her myself. Shadow Knight stared at him. And now? The old man's eyes burned with strange pride. I dug her up. He nodded toward the laundromat. The acid washer. The rumors. The fear. I needed people to believe the Crimson Mask had returned. From the shadows behind him, several young men stepped forward. Watching. Learning. The old man smiled faintly. Legends don't die, he whispered. Shadow Knight tried to lift his head, but the room swayed around him. Blood spread across the floor beneath his hands. The old man watched him quietly. You see it now, he said. This place doesn't need saving. Outside the broken window, the lights of Grim Hollow burned like 100 silent eyes. It needs memory, the old man continued. It needs fear. He gestured toward the young men standing behind him. They were silent, their faces half hidden in the shadows. Not gang members yet, but close. They remember the Crimson Mask, the old man said. And soon, they'll become it. Shadow Knight forced himself to breathe through the pain. You murdered someone, he said weakly. For respect, the old man replied. For order. He leaned forward in his wheelchair. If people believe the legend is back, they behave. They watch out for each other. They stay in line. Shadow Knight's strength finally gave way. His body collapsed fully against the cold floor. The old man picked up the rifle beside him. I'm almost dead anyway, he said calmly. But the legend will live longer than both of us. One of the young men stepped closer. What do we do with him? The old man looked down at the fallen hero. Take him back to the laundromat, he said softly. The washer is empty. The room fell silent again. And in that moment no one in Grim Hollow knew the answer to one question. Was the legend of Shadow Knight about to end? Or was this where it truly began? Comment 1 for the next part.